Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I have one of two authors for the book, The Psychological Safety Playbook. And the two authors are Carolyn Helbig and Minette Norman, who wrote the book together. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them. Minette is here today, but Carolyn unfortunately lost her voice and cannot participate in a podcast without a voice. So Minette is going to represent her. And thank you for doing that, Minette.
My pleasure.
So, building on her 3 decades leading global technical teams in the software industry, Minette Norman focuses on developing transformational leaders who create inclusive working environments with a foundation of psychological safety, a topic which is very dear to my heart. She has a deep commitment to fostering inclusion in the workplace and is a sought-after speaker in the areas of psychological safety, inclusive cultures, radical empathy, and collaborative teams. Carolyn Helbig, who is unfortunately unable to join us today, spent more than 15 years with McKinsey as a top management consultant and in leadership development, and has a deep expertise in science, helps leaders increase their effectiveness, optimize team performance, and transform their organizations through mindset, emotional intelligence, and psychological safety. She integrates neuroscience research that revolutionizes the way we understand human brains functioning and translates it into applicable and powerful leadership practices. Based on their own experiences and that of their clients, both Carolyn and Minette's ambition is to start a movement to create psychologically safe workplaces around the globe, which is a mission I also share. So welcome, Minette, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for inviting us, Maria. I'm sorry Caroline's not here, but I will do my best to represent us both.
Great. Well, I usually like to start by asking people to tell us a little bit about their background. So perhaps you could tell a little bit about your own background and childhood, and also in terms of the groups that you were born into, and whatever you know about Carolyn as well.
Oh, it's funny. I don't know much about Carolyn's childhood, but I will do my best to tell you what I know about her. But I guess I'll start. I was born in New Jersey, but my family moved to California when I was about 2.5. So I really grew up in Oakland, California. My family were first generation Americans. My grandparents came over from Russia and Poland. They were Eastern European Jews who escaped the pogroms in the early 20th century. And I grew up in a fairly liberal household in California and stayed here until I was about 18. And then I went to the East Coast for college, lived on the East Coast for 10 years and moved back to California. I studied drama and French in school and had every intention of being an actor when I grew up until I realized just what a hard life that is, going to auditions and getting rejected. And I ended up falling back on my second major, French. I was fluent in French. And I got a job in my early 20s when I was in New York at the French Trade Commission. And it was the first time I ever used computers. And it turned out I was really a quick study, and I was also good at helping other people learn how to use software, and I wasn't intimidated by it. And that's what led me to my 30 years that I spent in the software industry. I moved back to California in the late 1980s, and it was at a time when Silicon Valley was kind of just getting started. And I got my first job in tech at Adobe in 1989, and I was the writer of the Photoshop version 1.0 tutorial.
Ooh.
And I know it's sort of the high-tech industry ancient history, because this was like 1989. I started the software product. Photoshop 1.0 came out in 1990. And then I had about 10 years when I was doing technical writing. And then at some point, my manager said, Minette, I need you to be a manager. I really need someone to manage the writers. You would be a really good manager. I had honestly resisted going into management. I liked the hands-on work. But then what happened was once I said I had a small team, my first team I was managing were other writers. And I realized how interesting it is to lead people and how challenging and how very different every single human being is. And and that I, as a manager, needed to understand them and learn about them and get to know them on a human level if I was going to be able to be a decent manager. And that led me, honestly, through the next 20 years of my career in various management and increasingly large leadership positions. And I won't go into all of that, but I ended up my last 5 years in the software industry as a vice president of engineering practice at Autodesk, which is a big software company in the Bay Area. And in that time, my job was to transform how we develop software and really modernize how we develop software. And what I realized is that this is not as much a technology problem or challenge as it is a human interaction challenge, because people were very siloed, the teams were very siloed, and no one really worked together or collaborated. And we needed to get teams to work together and share code and not reinvent the wheel. And I just started to get myself an education in human interaction and a little bit of neuroscience and understanding collaboration and empathy, and stumbling on the concept of psychological safety and all of the reading I was doing. And I was also at that time really interested in helping women and people from other marginalized and underrepresented groups find their way, because I had often been the only woman in the room, and realizing just how hard and lonely that is and how we're not tapping into the talent that's here. So my focus was sort of moving away from technology and into just human interaction and better leadership, honestly. And finally, taking us through a 30-year career, in 2019, I left. I decided it was time to leave. I left the software industry. I had done sort of everything I could in one company. And I decided what I wanted to do is really focus on having my own business, helping leaders and their teams do better in terms of creating the conditions where everyone can thrive and do their best work. And that means building inclusive, psychologically safe environments. So that's what brings me to today. And I don't know if that answered the whole question that you wanted me to answer. And I'll do my best to tell you about Caroline, but I'll pause first.
Sure. Let's dive into what you just said a little bit more. I'm wondering, because you're the first American, generation born to parents that were escaping a difficult background. Is that
it was actually my grandparents?
Your grandparents.
So my parents were the first.
Your parents were the first generation.
Yeah.
Okay, so good thing I clarified that. Yeah, so your parents were the first generation, you're the second. And then how do you think that influenced your attraction to psychological workplace safety?
Oh, that's a question I have never thought of. I think really, I'm not sure it was tied to my childhood or my parents' or grandparents' experience as much as it was really tied to my own personal experience of feeling like I do not always feel safe to speak up. And I don't know if that's because I was a woman in a male-dominated environment, or if it was because I was a liberal artist in a bunch of technical teams. But I often had that feeling of being other, not quite fitting in. And maybe that is in some way tied back to my parents and my grandparents. I mean, I don't know. I didn't always feel like I was marginalized growing up. But, growing up, even in Oakland, I would often be the only Jewish kid in the class, and we'd have Christmas celebrations, and that wasn't something my family did. So there was maybe always that little element of being slightly different. And I think that stays with you for life. And then that feeling in the workplace of like not quite fitting in, that was reminiscent of something I had experienced early in life.
I think it puts you on the edge of belonging to different communities. So you can see inside and you can observe behavior more from that standpoint than of actually feeling like you belong there. And perhaps you developed some bridging skills that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
I think that's true. And I think there were also parts of my childhood that definitely influenced me. At some point, my mother was hospitalized. She was mentally ill. And when you're a young child and that happens to you, you definitely take on, I would say, a little bit of hypervigilance, right? That your mom's not well. There are things that you have to take care of, and you can't cause problems even as a young child because there are other problems in the household. And I know that stuck with me. I was very much, for a lot of my time, trying not to rock the boat because I knew it wasn't safe to rock the boat when I was a kid. And it was very interesting because later in my career, I ended up becoming someone who was kind of relentlessly challenging the status quo. And I think maybe I finally unblocked or overcame some of those childhood limitations that had been with me through my whole life.
Yeah, from one extreme to the other until you find the happy medium.
Exactly. Exactly.
Maybe that's the wisdom of elderhood.
I think so, is finding some balance there. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me a little bit about Carolyn and how you met her.
Yeah, this is such an interesting story. Carolyn and I have been working together now for 2 years, and we still have not met in person. That's the kind of wild thing about our collaboration. We met in an online class, a virtual class in early 2021. It was based on the work of Amy Edmondson, who's, the premier researcher on psychological safety. And we signed up for a class to run psychological safety assessments based on Amy Edmondson's work. And we hit it off. We were in a small cohort together in the class. We really liked the way the other person thought about leadership and human interaction. And then it was funny because I was on a podcast with one of the other students in the class, and it was a leadership podcast. And Carleen tuned in and heard me speaking. And she just said, I really resonated with everything you were talking about. And one of the things she heard me say is that I was saying, there's a lot of information about psychological safety based on research and academia, but it seems to stop there. And what I'm looking for is the practical information of, yes, I'm a leader who believes we should have a greater level of psychological safety, but I don't know what to do to make that happen. And so Caroline heard me say that, and she said, that's exactly what I was hoping for when I took this class. And she sent me this email in the summer. It was June of 2021. And the subject line was crazy idea. And she said, hi, Minette, it's Caroline from class. I heard you on the podcast. I heard what you said. You and I are really aligned. And here's my crazy idea. What if you and I collaborated on creating a brochure or a pamphlet about the how of psychological safety, which doesn't seem to exist? And so we came to we got on a Zoom call. I said, yes, of course, let's try it. And our initial idea was that we would just create something small that we could offer to our clients, because she's a leadership consultant. I am too. And we thought, well, at least we'll have some materials for them. But then it turned into this book, and we found this really great hybrid publisher in Canada called Page Two that was really interested in the book, and they wanted to take it on as a project. And so it became more than a book. And Caroline is so interesting because this is what I know. I don't know anything probably before her university, but I do know that she is a scientist, and she ended up studying biology and got a PhD in human genetics. But when she was in the lab, she was more and more interested in human beings and how the brain worked and how we interacted. And she left academia or the lab actually, and went into McKinsey as a leadership consultant. And she did that for a couple of decades while at the same time having and raising 4 kids. So she's a mom of 4 kids. And now I don't know how many years, maybe 5 years, she's been out on her own as an independent leadership consultant. And she still has her 4 kids at home and a husband. And I kind of don't understand how she does everything she does, because she is busy and fully engaged in everything she does. And she amazes me, honestly.
Well, someday when you meet in person, you'll have a chance to analyze that.
Yeah, we are meeting. We have a date, which is pretty cool. We are going to be keynoting together at the Search Inside Yourself Summit in Lisbon, Portugal in July this year. So we're really excited about that.
Wow. It's a really strange thing. Having worked with many people online, it's a very strange thing to meet them in person. You think it's just going to be instant, like, wow, like we've shared the bond really deeply on so many levels. It's just odd because you haven't had that physical connection and the chance to go through different types of small talk. And so it feels almost like you know too much, but you don't know enough. Just warning you.
Yeah, no, I'm so looking forward to it. One of the funny things was Caroline drew all the illustrations, the little stick figures that are in the book. And she's not a professional illustrator, but she's just very facile with drawing. And at one point, we were getting our first newsletter together to send to our mailing list. And she said, I'm going to draw a little cartoon of the 2 of us. And then she said, I don't know how tall you are. Who's taller? Because on Zoom, you don't know who's taller.
No, you really don't.
So I sent her my height, and she's like, oh, I'm a little bit taller than you are. So I think when she drew us, she put herself just slightly bigger. But yeah, you have no idea how big anyone is on Zoom.
You really don't. The first odd experience that I had, that was where I met somebody that I'd only known on Zoom, happened where we by accident met at a conference at an event. And when I saw her, I had to look way up because she's like 6'4", and I had no idea she was that tall. And and it just struck me how tall she was. I was like, wow, you're really tall.
In some ways, the virtual world is the great equalizer. We just don't know that much about each other, right? We see only our faces and torso on the screen.
Yeah, in some ways, for sure. So you just answered, with a question about how did the 2 of you meet and come to work together on this topic of psychological safety. And you wrote this really interesting book. And I've read lots of things about it, but I haven't read the book yet. I'm going to order it. And then you have also resources that go along with it,
Yes.
right? And an image gallery. So maybe you could tell me just a little bit about the book, and then I'll come back to some of my other questions after that. I know that there are these 5 major plays of the book. And what are those 5 plays and how do they fit together?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about how we came to this structure, and then I'll describe the 5 plays in the book. So first of all, when we were starting on it, and as I said, we thought about it as a brochure. And then when we started to think about it as a book, we both said, let us write the shortest possible book we could write that is useful and that is informative. So by design, it's quite short in terms of word count, because we know that leaders are often very busy. And I know when I was leading teams, and even today in my own business, I buy all these leadership or business books and I don't get through them because they're too long. So we wanted to write a short book. We also wanted to write a book that really was like a sports playbook, in that you could open it to any section and you could find something useful. And so the way we structured it was that we have this very consistent structure. We have 5 plays, which you can think of as chapters. And those 5 plays are, I'll just tell you what they're called. The first one is called Communicate Courageously. The second is Master the Art of Listening. The third is Manage Your Reactions. The fourth is Embrace Risk and Failure. And the fifth is Design Inclusive Rituals. So that's the overarching structure of the book. And then what we decided to do is, under each of those 5 plays, we have what we call 5 moves. And each of the moves are basically a single standalone topic. And an example of one of those is, I'll just take at random. The first one in play 1 is called Welcome Other Viewpoints. What am I missing? And I can describe like what's in each of those. But in each of these 5 moves that are in each of the plays, we have again a consistent structure. We have a why to try it. So we explain why it's important for psychological safety. And then we have a how to do it section. It's almost like an operating manual, because we wanted it to be highly, highly practical and actionable. So every one of the moves has a how to do it. And then it has a nutshell wrap up of like, what does it really mean? And it has an illustration and a quote often, and that's it. And so we repeat that 25 times through the book. And what we've been hearing from early readers and now readers who've bought the book is that, this is the most practical, useful business book I've seen in a long time, because I literally can just open to any page and say, there's something I can try out here, and I can put it on my desk and leave it there for the next day when I'm dealing with a different or more challenging situation. And that was the intent of writing the book.
That's the beauty of a playbook approach.
Exactly. And, we didn't want to just call it a playbook and write it as a normal book. We really wanted it to be plays and moves and try it out. And the other reason that we were attracted to the idea of a playbook was the word play itself, because as we were getting to know each other and talking, and we laugh a lot together, we really enjoy each other's company. And one of the things we realized is just how heavy and geeky and academic the conversation around psychological safety can be. And it can seem really very serious. And so we thought, why not try to lighten it up and get people to feel like this is something you can play with, you can experiment with, you can try things out, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And so that's why we also wanted to interject the idea of play, and why we have these like sort of whimsical figures throughout the book.
Well, without play, life is pretty boring.
It is. It is. It is. It is. And we also had a reflection. It was in a conversation with another podcast host that we were talking. One of the questions was, what are some of the signs of teams that are highly psychologically safe? And, we were talking about that in some depth, but then we both reflected on the teams that we've been a part of that really had a high level of psychological safety. And one of the features was that you can laugh together, and that levity is just part of day-to-day work. It's not like you're forcing it. And it's funny because you don't think about that often, but really, like, are you enjoying being with your colleagues? Are you able to laugh at yourselves and one another in a lighthearted way? That's often a sign that this is a pretty safe environment.
Well, last Friday, I did a presentation on humor in the workplace and its role in positive psychology and resilience in the workplace. And it turned out that presentation was given on International Humor Day. You may want to put that into your calendar. I certainly will.
I didn't know there was an International Humor Day.
Neither did I.
I will mark it for next year.
And it was really interesting to think about how workplaces that are characterized by lots of smiles and laughter show all the other characteristics of psychological workplace safety as well. And that's really, I don't know how to describe that. It's not a milestone. It's more like the character that permeates everything else, but I still don't have a right way to say it. But you brought that up again. So it's been a recurring theme over the past 2 weeks for me.
That's really interesting. And yeah, we didn't even, I think, deliberately think of that as a characteristic or, what's the word? Bellwether? I can't think of the word either. But yeah, like what is the sign that this is a psychologically safe environment? But that's obviously a very important one.
Maybe cross-cutting theme.
Right. Right. Underlying fabric. Yeah, there are lots of ways we could think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask you not about this, the signs of a psychologically safe workplace team, but what's your vision of a psychologically safe workplace? Because that's something that you want to promote around the world. So tell me a little bit about the vision that you and Carolyn share on that.
Yeah, we do indeed. We have both seen really toxic workplaces and some very positive, safe workplaces. And, what I've seen, unfortunately, in the Silicon Valley tech world is that it's rarer to be part of a psychologically safe team than it is to be in I wouldn't say always toxic, but, a team where people are quite guarded and they don't really say what's on their mind. And what we know, both from the research and from our own personal experience and from the experience of our clients, is that when you do have an environment that is highly psychologically safe, first of all, there's higher performance, there's better team engagement, there's more innovation, there's more creativity, there's more fun. And also, one of the things that's really important to us is that we deeply believe in the power of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And, you can hire a diverse workforce, but you do not get to inclusion and belonging. You do not get to really tap into the genius of the people that you've hired and the diverse perspectives unless you have a really strong foundation of psychological safety. The other thing that strikes us, just from what we see in the world, is how much people are suffering in the workplace. And that's globally. People are burnt out. People are having mental health issues. They are just done with the old style of leadership or, these toxic environments or these unsupportive environments. And we believe there's a better way. And it takes effort. I'm not saying it's easy. And that's why we wanted to provide some tools. But it's really a mindset shift for leaders. And that we're really hoping can take hold. And that is that as a leader, I am, and you didn't mention the subtitle, so I'm going to mention the subtitle of the book because it's really important to us. The subtitle of the book is Lead More Powerfully by Being More Human.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
We really, really believe that it is time for human, empathetic, imperfect, somewhat vulnerable leadership. And what that means to us is getting rid of that mask that so many leaders put on of I have to be strong, I have to be perfect, I can't show emotion, I can't ever make a mistake or admit a failure or change my mind. And we want to blow that up really and say the leaders that people will want to work with and for and who people will respect are the ones who are human and who can say, I really can't see everything because I have my own blind spots. What am I missing? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? They're the leaders that say, I'm having a really hard moment right now because that question hit me a little strongly and I'm going to just take a moment to pause before I respond. The leader that's going to admit they made a mistake. The leader who maybe has their mind changed when they get new information. And so we really believe that is possible and that can change the workplace for better for everybody all over the globe. And so that was really why we wrote the book and why we are trying to get a following and start a movement of people who want to do this in their own workplace.
So in this podcast, I really like to focus on people's memories, their incidents that they recall. Can you think of a time that you experienced a leader showing that type of vulnerability or when you did, and it moved the entire organization forward? If you're having trouble thinking about it, one just popped into my mind. I was on a call with a lot of other people who I figured they were much higher status than I was because they were all CEOs of very large manufacturing companies. And I was there as a consultant. And the person who was presenting was talking about procrastination. And he said how he was sitting at the C-suite table with everybody. And he said, there is one thing that I continuously procrastinate on. And I've tried everything to try and get myself to get past this. And I don't know what the issue is, but it's really a problem for me. And I don't know if anybody else is facing that, but I just thought I'd put it out there and see what we can explore, which I think is pretty brave. So he did that. And everybody else around the table said, me too. I'm having the same problem with exactly the same piece. Now, I don't remember exactly what it was because it was technical and that piece isn't sticking in my mind for the story. They all said, me too. And they said, maybe this is a problem in the company. So they looked at the company, which was a global international company, and they found that they had a very low customer satisfaction rate because their on-time delivery was so poor. So it turned out that this procrastination piece that they were experiencing was also something that was manifesting in the company. So they thought, well, why don't we make it safe for people to talk about this in the way we talked about it just now? So let's start with one site and just say, what are we procrastinating on that might be affecting our on-time delivery to customers? And what can we figure out together? And so they did that with one department in one site, and then they did it with the company. And then they asked each of the sites, how could you do this in a way that would suit your culture at your site? So they didn't just say, okay, let's replicate it and run it across the board. They did it that way. And within 18 months, they had moved, their on-time delivery was so low, it was 13%, up to 78% in 18 months. And then it just got better after that. And I thought that was a really beautiful example of creating a safe environment that allowed others to speak up, that solved a problem in the company. So it's not like he was spilling his entire life story, but it solved a problem in the company, and that they were then able to sensitively roll out in different sites in different countries without imposing a structure that might not have worked, that might have killed it too early, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know. Does that give you any ideas?
That's actually really rare. I haven't witnessed anything like that in my career, where I was sharing, because certainly things came to mind, and I can share a few things that came to mind when you asked the question. But by sharing sort of a vulnerability there, that it actually changed the outcome of something on such a large scale like on-time delivery. What I have seen is how it can be a bonding experience for a team. And maybe it doesn't change the on-time delivery or the actual financial performance, but it can change how a team interacts. And that I definitely experienced with my own staff at one point. I had a team that was a fairly global team, and we would come together once a quarter face to face and have a quarterly meeting. And I remember we were working with an outside facilitator because I was actually struggling to get the team to work together. It was a bunch of different functions that I had sort of inherited in my role, and everyone just did their own thing and worked very independently. And I really believed that we could work better and have bigger impact on the company if we combined forces more rather than just operating in silos. And so we were working with a consultant, and he was facilitating a session where he really believed that we needed to get to know each other better and to know each other as human beings, not just as what our function was in the workplace. And so he asked us each to share a story. And again, as you said, you don't have to spill your guts, but only as open and vulnerable as you want to be, but something from early in your life that formed who you are today and, what makes things important to you today. And I was the leader of the team, and I had to go first. And I ended up telling a story about what I mentioned to you earlier, because it was so formative, having a mother who really was not there for part of my childhood. And I had told that story before. I felt comfortable telling that story before. And what I didn't expect is for the tears to come when I told that story in front of my staff. And that's a really uncomfortable moment to cry in public at work. I was surprised by it. And what happened was very, very interesting and powerful, because there was just this, I would say, sense of empathy in the room that we probably had never had before. And I think also the fact they were feeling empathy towards me, but also it just allowed people to then say, okay, I'm going to tell something real. Again, it doesn't have to be the deepest, darkest secret of my life, but I am going to tell something real. It was a very bonding experience for us. And it carried forward into our interactions, not only over that meeting, but over the months and years to come, because we had just shared something about ourselves and we all connected on a more human level for the first time. You can't always just rush into that work. Like, we already knew each other. We had already worked together. So there was a certain level of, I know who these people are. I wouldn't necessarily do that exercise on the first day you meet someone, but we were at a point where now we could share a little bit more about ourselves. And it helped us to say, like, okay, I'm struggling with so-and-so. We're having a hard time, but I now remember something about that guy when he was a teenager that I feel soft-hearted towards. And it does help the interactions in a really interesting way.
Yeah, it elevates the conversation because it's more personal. It's something about when people share something about themselves that matters to them, that's authentic to their own deeper self. It brings out the best in others, unless you're in a group of people who are really traumatized and they can't get past their own desire to re-traumatize the group. But that often that moment can have a really important impact on the team. and on the atmosphere. If we don't connect the hearts, nothing else really matters, does it?
I agree. And, that's something that I really, truly believe is that the only way I was a successful leader in any way is that I connected one-to-one with human beings. And it was not only the people who worked directly for me, but everywhere I went, to every office, I would always make time to just talk to people I didn't know at any level in the organization and just know what's going on, a little bit about them. And that connection enables you to do amazing things. People just are like, oh, she's a fellow human being. It doesn't matter if she's an executive or whatever. We are all equally human.
Wasn't it Maya Angelou who said, they won't remember what you said, but they'll always remember how you made them feel?
Made them feel. Yeah. Honestly, when I left Autodesk, because I had worked there so long and I had a really big role in that I worked with thousands of people. A lot of people sent me notes. And to that point about Maya Angelou's quote, I got so many emails saying, you may not remember me. I met you in Singapore, but I'll never forget how much it meant to me that you stopped in the hallway to talk and ask about my work. And again, it was just it was a casual encounter, but it really meant something to people. And I think that's the part that we forget sometimes. It's the most important thing.
It is. It is, totally. As adults, you experience certain things, right? You experienced the tech culture, you experienced doing things in different countries. Perhaps you lived in different countries. You speak French. I don't know if your parents spoke French.
They didn't. They spoke Yiddish.
Yeah, they spoke Yiddish. So learning French introduces you to a culture and in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. So how would you say, as an adult, the things that you learned and adopted into your life became cultural influences for you?
Wait, I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you say it again?
So your profession is a culture. Your family is a culture.
Yes.
Your country, your region, the town you live in, the street you're on.
Yes.
The place where you buy groceries is a culture. Like every place where people are together is a culture because they start interacting and developing norms of behavior that are expected. And so as you become an adult, you become more conscious of the groups that you join and you learn things from them. And hopefully some of those things that you learn from them start to influence you and who you are. Like, for example, becoming a manager.
Yes.
But that's maybe being part of managerial culture is what affected you. I'm looking at not just from an individual, what did I learn? It's what was I taught from the groups that I belonged to as an adult?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like in many ways, I learned things that I didn't want to do a lot of the time. And let me explain that. So when I first started working in the world, that was in the 1980s, I got out of college and I was working for a lot of quite authoritative leaders. Like I remember when I worked at the French Trade Commission, it was honestly all male. All of the leaders were from France. They had all gone to the big business school in France. And they all went to l'ENA.
L'ENA.
Yeah, l'École Nationale de l'Administration. And they were of the same mold. And it was very much command and control. And I saw that and I'm like, oof, I do not like to operate on like that. And I wasn't even thinking about management then. Then I ended up in the tech world and I started to see different models. Like the first person I worked for was a woman. So I'm a big observer and I'm also, I can be a little bit of a sponge of absorbing what's around me. And I notice that I'm doing that. I'm a mimic somewhat. So if someone has an accent, it's really hard for me not to start speaking like them. And so I would take basically things that I thought were useful. And I saw an empathetic leader who really cared about her team. I want to be like that. But then I would see someone who was shaming someone in public. And I'm like, oh, I do not want to be like that. So I felt like my whole adult life was observing behavior and saying, I definitely don't want to do that. I'm not going to emulate that behavior. I might learn from this person that that's a really nice way to interact with people. And so I feel like everywhere I went, there was the observing piece and the what can I learn from this? And honestly, it was interesting when you said, do you have an example of a leader who did this thing? I don't have very many examples of great leadership, even over a 30+ year career. There were bits and pieces where I saw that was great and that was great, but there were so many instances of really damaging, harmful leadership. And so I feel like what formed me in many ways is understanding how I want to show up in the world that may be different from anything that I've seen before. And that culture of management and culture of being being in tech in the workplace. But also, I've been a volunteer in the community a lot. So I've always tried to do something. And for a while, my husband and I were teaching English as a second language to immigrants in the area where we live. And that also informs who I am, because I just see like this is a completely different culture. There are a lot of undocumented people that are working so darn hard, and they're just trying to learn English at night. And I'm just feeling like, oh my God, I live in one world and I'm bridging this gap to this other world. And I feel like that informs me. And honestly, all of that work, I now do work with homebound elders and take them to appointments. I feel like all of that work informs who I am too, because it just opens my heart. And I feel like my heart has grown over the years in terms of really caring deeply about people and caring about community. And I'm not just going to care about, working in a software company and making a lot of money and having stock options. That has never been what's motivating me primarily. What's primarily motivating me is doing some good in the world and helping people and feeling like I can be proud about what I'm doing.
Two things about what you said. One is, I think what you described as cognitive and cultural dissonance experiences, where you felt that it was a dissonance with what you already knew, and you had to make a decision about whether you were going to accept pieces of that or not. And this sense of cultural dissonance, for people that have never experienced it, they don't develop empathy to the degree that you would have developed it, because you can identify with people whose experiences are not even close to similar to yours. And people who haven't had that experience dismiss other people's experience. It's harder for them to include them because they just dismiss it as being either non-existent or irrelevant, or that their way is the only right way. And it seems to me that what you're saying is you discovered that there were many ways to experience life, and you wanted to be a part of that story.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I think you said that really nicely, Marie. It was interesting. Last September, I was giving a keynote up at Lake Tahoe for a company, and it was about empathetic leadership. That was the topic. And my husband came with me. It was a beautiful little getaway to Lake Tahoe, and we were having lunch one afternoon after a hike. And we were just in this restaurant that was pretty much empty because it was a weird time of day. And the server just came to chat with us a little bit, or he seemed kind of friendly because there was no one else in the restaurant. So I just asked him a question about like, how long have you been up here? Were you here when the horrible fires happened? And all of a sudden, it was just like he poured out his heart to us. And he told us about not only how long he'd lived there, but some of his own experiences and a depression that he had, and that he was leaving Lake Tahoe to move to Monterey with his family. But he said it was very bittersweet because he had such a community. And this is like sitting in a pizza restaurant at 4:00 with two people he's never talked to. And it was just this moment of deep human connection that you never know where it's going to happen. And that stuck with me. It's like we need to listen to strangers more often because it just opens our minds and opens our hearts.
Well, he sensed from you and your husband's attitude that you were going to be safe people to talk to. Maybe he'd gone through many days or months or even years without ever sensing that. But he noticed from the two of you, and maybe because there were less people in the restaurant at that time as well, but that there was this openness and invitation to share who he was, and that it was not going to hurt.
That's right. That's right. It was a really sweet moment. It was a very, very sweet moment.
So is that maybe part of your vision for a psychologically safe workplace where people feel safe to be who they are in that sense?
Yes, yes. And, one of our chapters is about listening. The second chapter is mastering the art of listening. I think that's one of the ways that we really do create a psychologically safe environment is we get curious enough to truly listen to someone else and not listen to respond and not listen to be right and share my ideas, but just to listen. And that is so powerful when we do it. And it's honestly so rare that we do it well, like that we're truly present and we're truly trying to understand the other person. Mm-hmm. And I think that is game changing. And Carolina and I put that as our second play because we just believe without listening to understand one another, we're not going to be able to establish those conditions. But when we do it well, people feel like, oh, they care about me. And I actually can show up as my true self as much as I want to reveal of my true self here. And I'm going to be valued and respected for who I am. And I don't have to conform to whatever the group norms are. I can actually just be me.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you one more thing, which is when you and Carolyn were working together on the book, collaborations can often feel really, really great, but there might be a moment when they don't feel great. You might have had some moment where there was frustration or disagreement, and that could even be surprising to you. And that's when the mettle of the relationship is really tested to see if you can really rise to that next level of collaboration. Do you experience any of that in your work with Carolina?
I feel so grateful that we haven't had any major disagreements. Now, we have disagreed on smaller things like even content or how things look, and we haven't had any major conflict. We've had this really fluid way of working together. And I do think that we have been practicing everything we preach in the book in how we work together. We really listen to understand. And I've caught myself occasionally when we've disagreed on something, feeling my defensiveness come up and then just going, okay, Minette, take a pause, listen to what she's saying, ask a clarifying question. And this is right from the book, basically. And then being able to hear what Caroline is saying and understand her perspective. And we've been able to work through differences in opinion about things really well. I think the only frustrations we may have had were until we got to know each other's working style. So, for example, I'm really quick and I manage my email very effectively. And Caroline gets behind on her email. So initially I was like, why isn't she responding? And I would have to remind her. And then I realized, okay, this is not her strength. And so we just agreed, I'm going to handle the email that we have with our publisher and editor and all of that. And she's going to handle other things like all of the illustrations and handling our Miro board and all the things I'm not good at. So I think the trick was that we kind of early on figured out who was good at what, and we let ourselves play to our strengths and complement each other's strengths well. So we haven't had a big test of a big disagreement to this point.
Well, if you're both practicing those principles that you're writing about, then the disagreements would be small and you would notice because you're self-aware enough. Oh, yes. I think I'm feeling defensive right now. I wonder what that's about. And then you open up to the person and say, so is this thing important to you because of this, or this? And you could be wrong, but then, it's just easier to negotiate the small things when you're not allowing triggers to be your reality. So
yes, and we don't let anything fester. I think that's also the thing. It's like if there's an issue, we talk about it right away. So yeah, no, I think that's true. We both have a high degree of self-awareness, and that's something we talk about as a really important skill to pay attention to in the book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading the book. And is there anything else that you would like to say? I mean, you could do a little promo of the book if you like, but in addition to that, if there's anything else you'd like to say, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I hope everyone will get the book. I would also encourage people, yourself included, you can go to our website, thepsychologicalsafetyplaybook.com. We've put together some really helpful resources that you can download. For example, what we did is there's something called the 25 moves. It's just a one-page PDF, and it's a visual representation of all 25 moves. And it's a great thing to keep at your desk as a reminder. Like, okay, listen to understand. Yes, I'm going to do that in this meeting, for example. But maybe just a little bit higher level than the book itself. What I would say is that every single person in every single group environment, whether it's a work environment or a social environment, you all have very large influence on how people around you are feeling in terms of their level of feeling included and feeling psychologically safe. It's not just the leaders, although leaders play a bigger role, maybe. Everyone plays a role. And so I would just encourage every single person to go out and try one new behavior that could really make a difference in a profoundly powerful and positive way. And you'd be surprised by how little shifts in behavior can make such a difference.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm going to get that PDF right away, right after our interview.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. It's on the resources page of the website.
Great. Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure, Minette. I am really sorry that we missed out on hearing from Carolyn, but I hope she likes what we've got.
I hope so too. And I'm sorry she wasn't here too. It would have been even much more interesting to have her perspective too, but maybe another time. But thank you for inviting both of us.
I'll just have to bring her back or bring both of you back for a second interview. That'll solve it.
Sounds great, Marie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minette. Minette Norman is one of two authors of the book, The Psychological Safety Playbook, Lead More Powerfully by Being More Human. She developed her sense of empathy and powers of observation growing up by being on the outside of many groups, and again as an adult being the only woman when she worked for high-level software companies. Her interest in human behavior developed within the tech environment when she took on management roles and found she had an edge through her ability to respond safely and empathetically to others. Fast forward to her current work in inclusive leadership consulting. When taking an international course online, she developed a friendship and resonance with another leadership coach, Carolyn Helbig, who pitched the idea that as a team, they develop a practical resource for their clients. This became a book with an approach consisting of 5 plays and 25 behaviors to help people lead at work with safety and humanity, no matter what their role and rank. I very much enjoyed the responsive dialogue we shared during this interview, and will bring Minette back with her co-author at a later date when she doesn't have laryngitis. Thank you so much for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee for a podcast owner? Well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MarieGervais. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.